the cold steel of a suppressed pistol pressed into the back of her neck. "Make it quick," the cartel boss muttered, turning his back on the overweight, trembling woman kneeling in the dirt. But before the trigger was pulled, she screamed a single name. "Camilla!" The boss froze. Harley Gallagher was not the kind of woman who blended into the shadows. At 28 years old, weighing just over 270 pounds, her sheer size made her a permanent fixture of background commentary in the unforgiving streets of South Boston. She was a big girl, and she knew it. She carried her weight with a quiet, exhausted defiance, hiding her soft curves beneath baggy, grease-stained aprons and oversized cardigans. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't glamorous. In a city run by sleek, sharp-suited men and the hollow-cheeked women who draped over their arms, Harley was entirely invisible, until the night she wasn't. For the last 4 years, Harley had worked the graveyard shift at O'Malley's, a 24-hour diner that smelled permanently of old coffee and industrial bleach. It was a haven for the city's insomniacs, drunk college students, and more frequently, men who spoke in hushed, jagged whispers in the corner booths. Harley minded her business. She poured the coffee, wiped down the sticky laminate tables, and ignored the occasional cruel remarks about her waistline thrown by the late-night patrons. It was a torrential Tuesday night in November when Harley's unremarkable life shattered. The diner was dead quiet. The neon sign buzzed ominously outside, casting a sickly red glow over the wet pavement. Harley had been tasked with taking the kitchen trash out to the alley dumpster. It was a miserable chore. Rain lashed against her face as she heaved the heavy black plastic bags over the rim of the rusted metal bin. She was panting softly, her broad chest rising and falling when she heard the distinct, sickening sound of a wet thud, followed by a muffled whimper. Harley froze, the lid of the dumpster slipping from her wet fingers. She peered around the edge of the rusted metal. 30 feet down the alley, barely illuminated by a flickering street lamp, 2 men stood over a third. Harley recognized the 2 standing immediately. They were regulars. Tommy the Hammer Russo and a younger, viciously sharp enforcer named Luca. Both were made men in the Romano Syndicate, the most ruthless organized crime family in Massachusetts. The man on the ground was bleeding profusely from his nose, begging on his knees. "I didn't take the skim. I swear to God, Tommy, I didn't." "God ain't the one balancing the books, Frankie," Tommy said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Before Harley could process the scene, Tommy raised a suppressed handgun and fired twice into the back of Frankie's head. Harley gasped. It wasn't a scream, just a sharp, involuntary intake of air. But in the echoing chamber of the brick alleyway, it might as well have been a gunshot itself. Tommy's head snapped toward the dumpster. "Who's there?" Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Harley's heart. "Run!" Her brain screamed the command, but her body was a heavy, cumbersome anchor. She turned, her rubber-soled diner shoes slipping wildly on the wet cobblestones. She pumped her arms, her breath coming in ragged, painful tears, but she was entirely out of her element. Her heavy thighs chafed violently against each other. Her lungs burned with the sudden exertion. She wasn't built for a sprint. She was built for endurance, for standing on her feet for 12 hours a day, not for outrunning mafia hitmen. "Hey, grab the fat chick," Tommy barked, his heavy boots splashing through the puddles behind her. Harley barely made it to the mouth of the alley before a heavy hand clamped down on the collar of her oversized sweater, yanking her violently backward. She let out a cry of terror as she hit the ground hard. The impact rattled her teeth, her heavy frame taking the brunt of the fall on the unforgiving pavement. Her knees scraped raw, blooming with instant painful bruises. Luca stood over her, his breathing completely even, a stark contrast to Harley's desperate, wheezing gasps. He looked down at her with a mixture of annoyance and disgust. "Look what we got here," Luca sneered, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her upward. Harley cried out, trying to plant her feet, but Tommy was already there, pressing the still warm barrel of his gun against her rib cage. "Please," Harley sobbed, her whole body shaking violently, her chest heaving. "Please, I didn't see anything. I was just taking out the trash. I'm nobody." "You're a loose end is what you are," Tommy grunted, shoving her toward a sleek black SUV parked illegally on the curb. "Get in the back. Move it." They shoved her into the rear of the vehicle. Harley struggled awkwardly to fit her wide frame into the back seat, her tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She felt entirely pathetic. As the doors locked with a heavy mechanical thud, she knew she was going to die. She was going to be another nameless, faceless body, dumped in the harbor, remembered by no one, mourned by no one. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but to Harley it felt like a lifetime. She spent the entire ride hyperventilating, her large hands gripping her knees to stop them from shaking. Tommy and Luca ignored her, occasionally shooting a glance in the rearview mirror and chuckling at her terrified, sweat-drenched state. They pulled into an underground parking garage of a high-rise building downtown, the legitimate corporate front for the Romano family. They hauled Harley out of the car. She stumbled, her legs feeling like jelly under her weight, but Luca roughly jerked her upright. They dragged her toward a private freight elevator, the ascent silent and terrifying. When the doors opened, she was shoved into a massive, sparsely decorated office that looked out over the glittering Boston skyline. The room was freezing, the air conditioning cranked high. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Matteo Romano. Matteo was a man carved from ice and violence. At 36, he was strikingly handsome, but his face was gaunt, his dark eyes hollow and completely devoid of warmth. For exactly 1 year, Matteo Romano had been a walking corpse. Ever since a rival faction had planted a car bomb meant for him, a bomb that had instead claimed the life of his beloved wife, Camilla, Matteo had descended into a ruthless, bloody paranoia. He ruled the city with an iron, merciless grip, purging anyone who even breathed out of line. He didn't look up as Harley was violently thrown to the center of the Persian rug. She landed on her hands and knees, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the expensive polished leather of Matteo's shoes. "What is this, Tommy?" Matteo's voice was a low, raspy baritone that sent a fresh wave of terror down Harley's spine. "Collateral, boss," Tommy said, stepping forward. "Frankie's handled. But Shamu here was lurking in the alley. She saw the whole thing go down." Harley squeezed her eyes shut at the insult, tears spilling over her lashes. Even now, facing death, she was nothing but a punchline to them. Matteo finally looked up from his paperwork. His dead eyes scanned Harley. He didn't see a woman. He didn't see a human being. He saw a liability. He saw a potential witness who could put his men behind bars and weaken his crumbling empire. "I swear to God," Harley cried, her voice cracking as she forced herself to look up at the terrifying mob boss. "I swear I won't say a word. I don't know who you are. I don't know who Frankie is. I just bake the pies at O'Malley's. Please, mister, I have a cat. I have rent. Just let me go back to my diner." Matteo leaned back in his chair, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "You bake the pies," he repeated, his tone completely flat. "Yes, I'm not a threat. Look at me." Harley gestured wildly to her heavy body, her tear-streaked, flushed face. "I'm a fat waitress from Southie. Nobody listens to me anyway. Nobody even looks at me. You think the cops are gonna take me seriously?" "She couldn't outrun a parked car, boss," Lucas snickered. "She ain't a threat, but she's still a witness." Matteo sighed, a long, weary sound. He rubbed his temples. He was tired of the blood, tired of the noise, but the rules of his world were absolute. He looked back at Harley, his expression entirely blank. "It's nothing personal," Matteo said softly. It was the chilling truth. He felt absolutely nothing. "But I don't leave loose ends. Tommy, take her out to the Pine Barrens. Eliminate her. Make it clean, deep grave. Leave no trace." Harley's heart stopped. The air vanished from her lungs. She stared at Matteo, the realization crashing down on her. Eliminate her. Tommy stepped forward, grabbing Harley roughly by her thick upper arm, his fingers digging into her soft flesh. "Up you get, sweetheart. Time for a road trip." Harley planted her knees into the rug. She fought against Tommy's grip, using her heavy weight as an anchor. "No, no, please, don't do this," she screamed, thrashing wildly. Tommy grunted, struggling for a second against her sheer dead weight. "Quit fighting, you stupid cow." He drew his pistol, pressing the cold steel of the suppressed barrel directly into the back of her neck. "Make it easy on yourself, or I blow your brains out right here on the boss's rug." "Make it quick," Matteo muttered, annoyed by the noise, turning his chair around to face the dark windows, dismissing her life entirely. The cold metal bit into Harley's spine. She was going to die. Right here, in her grease-stained apron and wet shoes. Her mind raced frantically, flashing through her life. And then a memory struck her like a bolt of lightning. A memory from 10 months ago. A rainy night, much like this one. A beautiful, bruised woman sliding into a booth at O'Malley's at 3 a.m. A woman shivering, terrified, hiding from the world. Harley had brought her hot tea and a slice of cherry pie. Harley had hidden her in the back office when aggressive men in suits came looking for her. The woman had stayed in the diner's back room for 3 days. They had talked. They had cried. And before the woman left, she had given Harley a small sealed envelope and a name. "If you ever see a man named Matteo Romano, tell him." Harley squeezed her eyes shut as Tommy cocked the hammer of the gun. "Camilla!" Harley screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the silent office. "Camilla!" The room went instantly, horrifyingly still. Matteo Romano froze. His chair stopped swiveling. Tommy hesitated, his finger slipping off the trigger, his eyes darting toward his boss. Nobody spoke that name. Not ever. It was a death sentence just to utter it in this building. Slowly, terrifyingly, Matteo turned his chair back around. His face was no longer blank. It was a storm of raw, unhinged fury and shocking vulnerability. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward with a violent crash. "What did you just say?" Matteo's voice was a lethal whisper. Harley gasped for air, tears pouring down her face. She looked at the madman approaching her. "I know, Camilla. I know your wife." Matteo crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Harley by the collar of her sweater, his knuckles white, his eyes withal and manic. He practically hoisted her upper body off the floor, displaying a terrifying physical strength. "My wife is dead," Matteo spat, spittle flying from his lips, his face inches from hers. She burned to death a year ago. How dare you put her name in your mouth to save your pathetic life? She wasn't in the car, Harley sobbed, the truth spilling out of her in a desperate torrent. She wasn't in the car, Matteo. She came to my diner. She was hiding. She knew about the brakes. She knew your brother rigged the brakes. The silence that followed was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a bomb counting down. Matteo released her, stumbling backward as if he had been physically struck. His chest heaved. He looked at Tommy, then back at the heavy, trembling woman, gasping for air on his floor. The fat waitress from Southie didn't just witness a murder. She held the ghost of the only woman the Mafia Boss had ever loved. "You're lying," Matteo whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, ragged edge. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Harley entirely. "My brother Dominic is my blood. Camilla burned in that Cadillac on the expressway. I buried her ashes. Do not play games with a dead woman's memory to save your own skin." Harley shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. "I'm not lying," she cried, her voice cracking as she pressed her heavy hands against her chest. "She was wearing a silver locket. It had a tiny engraving of a swallow on the back. She said you gave it to her on your anniversary in Palermo. She told me Dominic cornered her in the garage. He told her she was a distraction, that she was making you soft. He rigged the brakes while she hid behind the concrete pillars. The woman in the car, it was her maid, Maria. Camilla ran. She ran in the rain until she found my diner." Tommy and Luca exchanged uneasy, horrified glances. Maria, the maid, had famously gone missing the same night Camilla died. The details were too specific, too brutally accurate for a random diner waitress to invent. Matteo's face drained of all color. The ruthless, untouchable mafia boss suddenly looked like a man who had been gutted. He stared at Harley, his dark eyes searching her terrified, tear-streaked face. "Where is she?" Matteo demanded, his voice breaking, a desperate, violent plea. "Where is my wife?" Harley let out a tragic, shuddering sob. She looked down at her scuffed diner shoes. "I don't know where she went. She only stayed in the back room for 3 days, but before she left, she gave me a sealed envelope. She told me to keep it safe. She said if I ever saw you, if I ever knew it was really you, to give it to you." Matteo grabbed her shoulders. His grip was tight, but it wasn't the violent, punitive hold Tommy had used. It was the grip of a drowning man clinging to a raft. "Where is the envelope?" "It's at my apartment," Harley whimpered. "In Dorchester, under the floorboards, under my bed. Please, I'll give it to you. Just don't kill me." Matteo spun around, his long, dark coat sweeping the floor. "Tommy, get the car. We are going to Dorchester. Now." "Boss, wait," Luca cautioned, stepping forward. "If Dominic really did this, if Dominic set you up—" "I said get the car," Matteo roared, a terrifying sound that shook the very glass of the skyscraper. 20 minutes later, the black SUV pulled up to a crumbling, low-income apartment building in Dorchester. The rain was still coming down in sheets. Tommy and Luca flanked Matteo, their weapons drawn and concealed under their jackets. Matteo walked right beside Harley. He didn't shove her. He didn't let his men touch her. He stayed close, his eyes scanning the dark, wet street with lethal paranoia. Harley led them up 3 flights of stairs. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, she was out of breath, her heavy chest heaving, sweat mixing with the rainwater on her forehead. She felt deeply ashamed of her size, of how pathetic she must look, gasping for air in front of these hardened killers. But Matteo didn't mock her. His eyes were entirely focused on the peeling wooden door of apartment 3B. She unlocked the deadbolt with trembling fingers. The apartment was tiny, smelling of cheap vanilla candles and old books. It was cramped, cluttered with thrift store furniture, a stark contrast to the sterile, multi-million-dollar empire Mateo ruled. "Under the bed," Harley panted, leading them into the shoebox-sized bedroom. She dropped to her knees, struggling slightly to wedge her thick arm under the heavy oak frame of the bed. She popped a loose floorboard she had discovered years ago and pulled out a dusty, wax-sealed envelope. She held it up to Mateo. Mateo took it, his hands that had strangled men to death, shaking visibly. He broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, unmistakably Camilla's elegant cursive, and a small brass key. As Mateo began to read, the silence in the room grew suffocating. Harley watched a tear, a single impossible tear, roll down the ruthless mob boss's cheek. Before Mateo could speak, the front door of the apartment exploded inward. Splinters of cheap wood showered the living room. Harley screamed as a barrage of suppressed gunfire ripped through the thin plaster walls. "Get down!" Mateo roared. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, throwing his body against Harley's, tackling her heavy frame to the floor, just as a line of bullets tore through the space where her head had been a second prior. The sheer force of his tackle knocked the wind out of her, sending them both crashing into the cheap drywall. Tommy and Luca were already returning fire, their guns flashing in the dim light of the apartment. "Dominic found us," Tommy shouted over the deafening pop of gunfire. "He must have had a tail on us. He knows the girl talked." Mateo's eyes darkened with a demonic, absolute rage. He looked down at Harley, who was curled into a ball on the floor, weeping in absolute terror, her large body trembling violently. She was soft, unprotected, and completely innocent, and she had guarded his wife's final secret for nearly a year. "Luca, cover the hall," Mateo barked, pulling his own weapon, a customized Kimber 1911. He grabbed Harley's thick arm. "Stay behind me. Do not let go of my coat. Do you understand me?" Harley nodded blindly, tears streaming down her face. She grasped the expensive wool of his overcoat with a white-knuckled grip. Mateo moved with terrifying precision. He stepped into the hallway, firing 3 rapid shots. 2 of Dominic's hitmen dropped dead in the corridor, blood pooling on the cheap linoleum. Mateo pulled Harley forward, shielding her wide frame with his own body. He was entirely fearless. They made it down the fire escape, slipping in the rain. Harley's heavy thighs burned, her breath scraping her throat raw. But the sheer adrenaline and Mateo's unyielding grip pulled her forward. They piled into a stolen sedan, Tommy hot-wired in the alley, peeling out into the Boston night just as police sirens began to wail in the distance. In the back seat, Harley sat beside Mateo, hyperventilating, waiting for the bullet that would end her life. Instead, Mateo looked at her in the dim glow of the streetlights. His gaze wasn't cold anymore. It was intense, burning with a strange, dark gratitude. "She was pregnant," Mateo said softly, his voice cutting through the noise of the engine. Harley gasped, covering her mouth. "The letter," Mateo continued, staring at the piece of paper in his blood-stained hands. "Dominic knew she was pregnant. He wanted the throne. He couldn't risk me having an heir, so he tried to kill her. She ran to protect the baby. She hid at your diner, and then she went to a private clinic in Vermont, the Sisters of Mercy convent." Mateo carefully folded the letter. He turned to Harley, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "She died, Harley. Complications during the birth, 6 months ago. The nuns couldn't save her. But she left the key to a safe deposit box with a trust for my daughter. My daughter is alive. Harley let out a sob, the tragedy of it all crashing down on her. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Mr. Romano. Do not apologize, Matteo commanded, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching Harley's tear-stained cheek. The contact sent a shock wave through her. No man had touched her with anything but disgust or pity in a decade. Matteo's touch was reverent. You fed her. You hid her when she was terrified. You kept her secret. You saved my daughter's life. The safe house was a sprawling estate on the cliffs of Cape Ann, heavily guarded by loyalists Matteo had quietly summoned. For 2 days, Harley was kept there, not as a prisoner, but as a protected guest. She was given silk robes that accommodated her size, hot meals, and a luxurious bed. It was a dizzying shift in reality. Downstairs, a war was raging. Matteo had systematically dismantled his brother's faction. The streets of Boston ran red as the Romano family tore itself apart. Harley stayed in her room, listening to the muffled sounds of encrypted phone calls and the loading of weapons. On the 3rd night, the war ended. Dominic Romano was dragged into the grand foyer of the estate, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the knee. Luca and Tommy threw him onto the marble floor. Harley stood at the top of the grand staircase, clutching the railing, watching the horrific scene unfold. Matteo stood over his brother. He looked like the Grim Reaper himself. She was carrying your niece, Dominic, Matteo whispered, the quietness of his voice infinitely more terrifying than a shout. She made you weak, Dominic spat, coughing up blood. You were losing the city, Matteo. I did what I had to do for the family. You are no longer family, Matteo said coldly. He raised his weapon and fired a single shot into Dominic's forehead. The echo rang through the cavernous hall. Harley clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling her scream. Matteo slowly turned around, looking up the staircase. He saw Harley standing there, trembling in her oversized silk robe. He didn't look ashamed of the blood on his hands. He wiped his gun, handed it to Luca, and walked slowly up the stairs until he was standing on the step just below her. It's over, Matteo said softly. The threat is gone. Are you going to kill me now? Harley whispered, her voice shaking. I've seen too much. I know everything. Matteo's brow furrowed. He stepped up, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hands resting on her wide, soft waist. Harley stiffened, her breath catching. She wasn't used to this. She was large. She was plain. She was invisible. But the way Matteo looked at her, it made her feel like the center of the universe. Kill you, Matteo murmured, his eyes tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the fearful widening of her eyes. You are the only pure thing left in my world, Harley. You protected Camilla when my own blood betrayed her. You held my daughter's future in your hands, and you didn't ask for a dime. He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. The scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne enveloped her. Tomorrow I am going to Vermont, Matteo whispered against her lips. I am going to bring my daughter, Rosa, home. And you are coming with me. Meh, Harley breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. I don't belong in your world, Matteo. I'm just a waitress. You are whatever I say you are, Matteo replied, his voice dark, possessive, and thick with a sudden, overwhelming affection. And I say, you belong by my side. You will be Rosa's godmother. You will never wash another table, pour another cup of coffee, or live in fear again. Anyone who disrespects you, anyone who looks at you with anything less than absolute reverence will answer to me. Harley looked into his hollow eyes and saw the jagged, broken pieces of a man who needed something soft and true to anchor him. And in him, she found the fierce, uncompromising protector she had always deserved. Months later, the underworld of Boston spoke in hushed, confused whispers. Matteo Romano had a new woman by his side. She wasn't a supermodel. She didn't wear tight, revealing dresses. She was a heavy-set, quiet woman named Harley, who carried the ruthless Mafia Boss's infant daughter in her arms. But when Harley walked into a room, made men bowed their heads. When she spoke, the room fell silent, because everyone knew one undeniable truth. Matteo Romano would burn the world to ashes for the fat girl who saved his soul. What a wild, emotional roller coaster. From the gritty alleys of Boston to the luxurious, dangerous heights of the mafia underworld, Harley proved that true strength doesn't come from your size, but from your heart and loyalty. If you loved this intense story of betrayal, redemption, and unexpected romance, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, true-to-life dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Harley's shoes?